Let's begin with the 1950 fiscal year budget. The budget would shrink to its lowest level at $3.5 billion. This would reduce the Navy by 74 ships. Of most importance, it would lose one entire carrier group. This meant it would lose one fleet carrier, 2 light carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 14 destroyers, 5 destroyer escorts, 7 submarines, and 39 amphibious and auxiliary ships. The Navy would budget for around 420,000 personnel, but unfortunately would fall far short in filling that. On the day North Korea invaded South Korea, the Navy would only have 381,538 personnel, a far cry from what was needed to fill even a demobilized Navy. 1950. To the embarrassment of the Navy, its only battleship, the USS Missouri, ran aground at Hampton Roads, Virginia on January 17th. It is so stuck that it takes 23 vessels over 2 weeks to free it. On February 12th, while working on the 1951 fiscal year budget, President Truman ordered Secretary of Defense Johnson to reduce the total U.S. military budget from $14.5 billion in 1950 to $13 billion for 1951's budget. Johnson scoffed and said not only could he meet that, but he could effectively lower it to $12.6 billion. His plan was to take the most from the U.S. Navy. He was planning on reducing the carrier force to just 5 carriers, along with the reduction of some 50 more ships. In his mind, naval aviation was just a far less capable duplication of the Air Force bomber force. February 25th through March 11th saw Operation Portrax take place. It was a joint amphibious exercise off the coast of Puerto Rico that simulated a landing invasion using all branches of the military. Although smaller than Operation Mickey just the previous year, Operation Portrax consisted of more coordinated joint maneuvers with Naval Surface and Aviation Units, the 3rd Infantry Division and 82nd Airborne Division, tactical and airdrop units from the Air Force, and some 17,000 Marines. Many lessons learned from this operation would be applied in actual combat during the landings at Incheon 6 months later. On April 7th, the National Security Council paper 68, or better known as NSC 68, was published. Starting with the communists winning the Chinese Civil War and the USSR detonating an atomic bomb, NSC 68 began its formation. It would be the guiding document of the U.S. military in the Cold War. It designated the Soviets as the main threat to democracy and sought to counter it with a massive build-up program for the military. This would be the exact opposite approach that Truman was currently pursuing at the time. The Defense Department would spend most of the summer of 1950 proposing to the president the exact cost of this new approach to foreign policy. On April 8th, tensions greatly rise between the US and the USSR as the Soviets shoot down a naval patrol craft over the Baltic Sea. All 10 crew members are never seen again and presumed killed in action. On the 21st of April, the first carrier takeoff of an AJ-1 Savage heavy attack bomber was made from the Coral Sea. This is the Navy's first use of an atomic bomber on a carrier. On June 24th, Secretary of Defense Johnson returns from a tour of allied nations in the Pacific. After visiting Japan, he tells the president there is no foreseeable threat from North Korea into South Korea. The next day, on June 25th, North Korea invaded South Korea and the Korean War begins. It is not until 2 days later that the U.S. gets involved. 4 days after North Korea invades, on June 29th, the USS Juno becomes the first naval ship to engage enemy forces as it bombards North Korean positions ashore. 3 days later, it is engaged by North Korean torpedo boats. 3 enemy craft are sunk without damage to the cruiser. On July 3rd, the aircraft carrier Valley Forge, the only U.S. naval flat top operational in the Western Pacific, joins the British carrier Triumph in launching the first naval airstrikes of the war. With massive manpower shortages coming to light with the beginning of hostilities in Korea, on July 19th, the president asked the Secretary of Defense to activate the naval reserves to fill the need. This was followed with the decision to extend enlistments by 12 months. In the end, a total of 174,610 reservists would be reactivated during the Korean War, which would make up 25% of the fleet. That same day, the first big order of ships to be reactivated from the mothball fleet was given. Unfortunately, due to the budget cuts, the maintenance of the mothball fleet was much neglected. The major warships like the battleship and aircraft carrier took priority, while all the amphibious ships were left to fall in disarray. Ironically, it was to be these very amphibious ships that were in highest demand for reactivation. 54 ships, mostly amphibious, began the activation process and were ready 2 months later in September. In total, 564 ships of all types would be reactivated from the mothball fleet and placed into service. This was all done by the following March, just 8 months from now. Along with this was the call-up of Naval Air Reserve squadrons of all types. A total of 21 reserve squadrons were called into active service and were ready for deployment by October. By the end of the conflict, a total of 42 Naval Air Reserve squadrons would be activated, which equated to around 700 aircraft. This would be the backbone of naval strength through the Korean War. On August 1st, the second Essex-class carrier, the USS Philippine Sea, joined Task Force 77 in providing naval aviation and theater. Eventually, the USS Lady would join the task force in October. Task Force 77 would provide continual naval aviation for the Korean War. September 15, 1950 would see one of the most daring operations in military history. The landing at Incheon would include some 75,000 troops and 261 naval vessels. This would eventually lead to the recapture of the South Korean capital at Seoul 2 weeks later and change the momentum of the war. The code name for the operation was Operation Chromite. On September 19th, Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson would be forced to resign by President Truman. He was replaced by George Marshall, who would become the third Secretary of Defense. On September 25th, after striking mines in Korean waters, 2 destroyers were heavily damaged and 1 minesweeper was sunk. At this juncture of the war, intelligence estimates that some 3,500 enemy mines are in the waters around Korea. Mine warfare would become one of the major and more important operations during the Korean War. November 9th through the 19th, Task Force 77 conducts a week and a half of strikes against the bridges crossing the Yalu River. Watch the video on the True Yalu Bridge missions from the movie Devotion for details on the raids. On the first day of the raids, November 9th, sees the first jet versus jet combat in naval aviation history as F9F Panthers of VF-111 from Philippine Sea engaged Chinese MiG-15 fighters. Lieutenant Commander William T. Amen becomes the first naval aviator to shoot down a jet. November 25th through the 27th sees 300,000 Chinese troops cross the Yalu River and engage U.S. troops. The 1st Marine Division encounters 8 Chinese divisions around the Chosin Reservoir. U.S. Navy aircraft join Marine planes in providing vital close air support to the embattled Leathernecks for the next 17 days as the Marines withdraw. On December 4th, while flying close air support for the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, Ensign Jesse Brown is shot down and is pinned in his aircraft, not able to get out. Lieutenant Thomas Hubner purposefully crash lands his own aircraft to help save Brown. Brown, the first African-American naval aviator, is not able to be rescued and eventually dies. Hubner is rescued by a helicopter and eventually is awarded the Medal of Honor. Watch this video from the Devotion series that goes into detail of these events. On December 10th, ships from Task Force 90 began evacuation of U.S. troops from the Chosin Reservoir in Hungnam, North Korea. The 2-week effort results in 105,000 American and South Korean troops, 91,000 civilians, and 350,000 tons of supplies and equipment taken aboard ships. By the end of 1950, the Korean War has been going on for 6 months and is gearing up to be a protracted conflict. Click here for the next episode of the series. Make sure to subscribe, like, and hit the bell button. This is U.S. Military History.